Now in session number 32, we're going to talk about effectiveness perspectives, or the ENTJ. And we just got done in the previous session talking about effectiveness is paired with memory, or the ESTJ type. So now we're going to talk about what effectiveness looks like when it's paired with an intuitive style. All right, so the driver, still effectiveness, as we talked about in the previous session. Effectiveness is all about what works. It's all about metrics. It's all about getting goals accomplished, utilizing resources, putting people in motion to get something big accomplished. And a piece of what effectiveness is fantastic at is talent scouting. Now, we didn't really talk about that piece with the ESTJ, but both of the effectiveness styles are very good at talent scouting. They're very good at figuring out which people are used as a great resource in which position. It's called in business putting the right people on the bus in the right seats, and effectiveness is particularly good at that. Now, when you pair it with perspectives, though, this is an intuitive process, and remember, it's introverted intuition. So it's about understanding the meta perspective. It's about understanding basically the way the mind works and watching the mind works in order to understand implications, insight, projections into the future, longer range timelines. It's really about understanding the pattern of the patterns and how people think. We call it not just thinking outside the box, but thinking about the box itself. Now, as opposed to somebody who's driving with perspectives, and we've talked about those types. We've talked about INFJs and INTJs. As opposed to somebody who's driving with it, perspectives is not going to be their flow state. So it's going to be interesting to use perspectives, but it's not going to be totally natural. It's not going to be their go-to tool. They're still going to want to be doing effectiveness, which is about getting things done. Now, if an ENTJ wants to just keep getting things done and just go, go, go. Remember, they're in the management portion, so they want to be in control. They want to be affecting change. They want to be the person who is in charge. If they don't want to think about the implications of their actions, and before we talked about memory, it was implications based on how things have impacted them over time, understanding how the conglomeration of their experiences has crafted who they are as a person. Perspectives thinks in a broader sense even than that. It's not even so much about what has impacted in them. It's about understanding how things are impacting people by shifting into their perspective, by seeing a long timeline, by looking at things in terms of long-term sustainability. And if they don't want to have to do that, if they just want to implement, if they just want to make stuff happen, they'll skip their co-pilot process of perspectives and go to the 10-year-old of sensation, which is all about action, right? Get into action. Action, action, action. Let's go, go, go. And just make it happen. So it looks very similar to the ESTJ. It's about just making it happen. However, when an ENTJ make sure that they use the perspectives process. Now we don't just see somebody who's fantastic at management. Now we see somebody who is able to mobilize huge numbers of people and resources because they see such a big, expansive perspective in order to create extreme strategy. Now, effective is usually pretty good at strategy. It's a linear process that goes, I'm going to use this resource and this resource and this one, all in the line to get something accomplished. And both of the effectiveness styles do that. ESTJs do that, though, for something that's concrete, something that's tangible. That's why they're so good in business management. ENTJs, though, can do this on a different plane or a slightly different plane. They don't have to necessarily see the implications in an immediate context. They can do so over the long term, or they're better at doing it in the long term, and so they make what I consider to be the best military strategists. Military strategists understand concepts like sometimes you have to lose the battle to win the war, and they see long-term implications. ENTJs oftentimes aren't people who are just CEOs. Oftentimes they're people who are running countries because they can take in so much territory. Now, this doesn't mean that the ENTJ is better than the ESTJ. It's just a different way of applying effectiveness. One is trying to get their metrics to give them results here and now, which is a very important role in making sure that management is happening. Literal maintenance and management is what ESTJs are focused on. ENTJs are more focused on the conceptual portion of using effectiveness to generate a system that may or may not be immediately applicable, but will be applicable in an ecological, long-range, sustainable level. So somebody who right now is focused on alternative forms of power, Okay, I know of quite a few ENTJs that are very interested in alternative forms of power. Now, alternative forms of power are not necessarily immediately implementable, and they're not something we have to maintenance at this point because they're brand new. They're fresh new. A lot of these different ecological styles of gaining power are things that we're just starting to implement. But to an ENTJ, that's more interesting because then they can do a long-range planning, and they can make sure that it's not just happening, but it's happening effectively, that it's happening not in a short-sighted way, but in a long-range, sustainable way. So that's the difference between the two. The ESTJ likes to maintenance something and to implement something that right now that you can be interacting and engaging with it, and that's something that they can see, you know, over the long term. They can create a system that over the long term is great. But a perspectives person will see down the line like an INTJ will. They'll see future implications of technology. Now, they don't have the long-range depth that an INTJ does, not necessarily. They can't quite see as long into the future because they're not practicing this process as much. However, they still have an ability to see into the future enough to be able to create a, you know, like a sustainable model. Now, if they don't want to do that, though, if they just want to go, 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 they go to the 10-year-old of sensation. And oftentimes that looks like jumping into action without thinking of the implications and running those simulations and really doing that huge strategy. And usually you'll see this in terms of making a quick buck. Okay, if an ENTJ just wants to become very wealthy very quickly, they will skip that sustainability piece in order to quickly have a payoff. And they're usually pretty good at it. Unfortunately, they are not creating sustainable systems, and so they're offending their own processes. And like I mentioned before in a previous session, when you offend your own process, there's a piece of your soul that screams at you that that was the wrong thing to do. And even an ENTJ is going to feel this. So when they go to the sensation process of just getting into action, that's frequently when they have problems. The other time I've really seen this is when an ENTJ doesn't go out for the greatness that they feel they were meant for. I know a couple of ENTJs that see themselves as these huge strategists, who see themselves as people who can implement big things, but they're not, there's a fear of ambition in there. There's a fear of loss of control of their life. That if they step up for something bigger, they might get some feedback in the world that they could fail, and of course pass. You know, that pass-fail piece is so important to them, to pass to succeed, that if they get too gun-shy about failure, they won't question the implication of sitting around doing nothing. Or they usually don't sit around doing nothing. They're usually fairly industrious still, but they'll throw their energy at something that isn't that important. They'll throw their energy at something that, you know, may or may be enjoyable for the time, but isn't really what they want to be doing. But they use sensation as a litmus for whether or not they want to be doing it, which is, does it interest me in the moment? Is it fun? Is it engaging? So let me take an example. I know some ENTJs who are absolutely stunningly brilliant and spend all their time playing video games, okay? Like strategy video games. Fantastic at it, will beat anybody online, are absolutely amazing, and they're not going out for the greatness that they could be. So they're diminishing and marginalizing their impact on the environment, and that feels bad, but they're not thinking about it in perspectives. They're not going, okay, if I keep doing this, then eventually I'm going to get old and be past my prime, and I'm not going to be able to impact the environment like I want to, but I'm not going to think about that because right now I'm having fun. Right now I'm enjoying life. So I'm just going to go straight to sensation and do that. That makes a little part of their soul scream at them. And so there ends up being some cognitive dissonance for them as well. But they want to have total control over their life. They want to have total management over their life, and they put themselves out for greatness. That might not work, right? Like that might actually mean that they have to go through some test, iterate, and some pass fail, and they might have to fail sometimes, which effectiveness really truly hates. So the sensation process can show up for them as indulgence, just like it shows up for the sensation inferiors. It's indulgence, but not just sensory indulgence, but rather time indulgence. Indulgence where you don't want to have to think about the implications of you not reaching out for your greatness. It can also be, you know, like I've got on the slide, it misreads body language or observable evidence to support specious conclusions. All right, so if effectiveness is really wanting to believe something, it'll look for evidence in the outside world that confirms it and go, see, I knew the whole time, right? I knew that. But it's really not sensation they want to be using to confirm conclusions. They want to be going to perspectives and asking themselves about the conceptual piece. That's actually where they fuel the best information. They can also turn to food, alcohol, sex, etc., to avoid reaching out for their greatness, and that's what we just mentioned, that they could go to sensation as opposed to actually going to perspectives and saying, what's the long-term sustainable impact that I could have. The more they go to perspectives, the more they'll actually be managing their life well, and they won't feel like they have to grab onto everything to micromanage. If they don't go to perspectives, they'll create a life where they insulate themselves from feedback that says that they're wasting their life, and they'll manage every little piece of that life in order to create that bubble. And it's, oddly enough, it looks like a bastardized version of the opposite type. It looks like a version of trying to cut out any feedback that would, require it to look at itself in a with any sort of true introspection. Now, if they go to perspectives first, if they're able to see things in long-term range, if they're able to see things in implications and strategy and bringing their best self to the world and helping the world create sustainable models, then they can go to sensation for a number of different ways. They can go to sensation to be playful. They can go to sensation to be fun, to be energetic, to get the drive to make things happen. Sensation is actually not a bad thing on an ENTJ. They can be actually rather fun to hang out with, but that's not what they want to be using as their primary information source. They want to be using perspectives in order to create those systems where they actually are able to manage their life. So how does the 3-year-old show up for them? Very similar to ESTJs. They can become quite depressed if they are in a time period of stress. They need to monitor themselves for depression like they would for a friend, all the same markers as for an ESTJ. They can also become rigid in their ethics. We talked about that before, that they might have an interest in ethics, and it might look very childish, but for an ENTJ, there might be a rigidity to it. ESTJs also tend to be a little rigid in their ethics or morals. They want to have integrity. They want to make sure that they're doing things that they're proud of, but oftentimes they're using their past to inform them of that. For a perspectives person, they're using more of a conceptual model to help inform their ethics, but if they're not going to perspectives enough, if they're going to sensation and just using their experiences to fuel that, oftentimes they'll be highly rigid in their ethics, and they'll be uncompromising, meaning that if you offend them, they'll cut you out of their life and they'll never talk to you again, which is a terrible way to maintain any form of intimacy. But again, that's them trying to manage the world. So perspectives helps them broaden and get inside somebody else's head and recognize how what that person is doing makes sense to them, so they're able to have more of a graciousness to other people when people don't meet their expectations or don't do what they think is the effective thing, that they're not being a good little resource and behaving how they're supposed to. Perspectives will help humanize the other person so they don't have to be as rigid, whereas if they're not using perspectives, then authenticity, when it flares up, will look totally rigid, will look completely offended, and will cut those people out of their life. It could be family members, it could be good friends, it could be mates. The same diagnosis creates the same prescription, which is if they need to go to that authenticity place, they can be passively entertained with a good versus evil movie. They can listen to music that helps them manage their emotion, right? Help kind of express it through the musical format, and use music to get them back into a good mood or the kind of mood that they want to be in. They can do that very, very childlike, unsophisticated form of journaling that can be very healthy. I actually knew an ENTJ that went to something called Life Book. It's a 5-day coaching event where you write down your life as you want it to be, and then you walk away with this beautiful leather-bound journal that has, your life and the projections of your life, and you have your life book. And the way that he made it sound like a 5-day effectiveness authenticity project for him. It was that polarity, and it was really good for him to be able to write down and express the projections of what he wants based on his feelings of desire. So things like that might be good. Now, I think Life Book is a very expensive 5-day coaching piece, but something to that effect, basically, something that mimics that, which is feel free to journal, even if it's not something that turns codified and leather bound in a life book. The ability to write down your impressions and your thoughts and do some journaling is actually very powerful for authenticity 3-year-old. All right, so Remember that, you know, as we're talking about these EJs, that they're extroverts, so they're going to project. They're going to appear more controlling because they're all leading with either effectiveness or harmony, which is extroverted judging, which is, I think everybody should be doing what they should be doing, right? I believe I have the ability to judge outside actions and how things work, and so they're probably going to come across more judgmental than the other types. In fact, I would say EJs come across as the most judgmental. IPs are judgmental as well, in the sense that they're introverted judging. They're judgmental in a quiet way. They're secretly judging you. So it's not as obvious. When you really engage with them, though, you get to a point where like, oh, I see how you're definitely judging primary. And even if it's a slow process like authenticity, once it gets to its conclusion, it will dig in its heels and it will absolutely not let go. So it's very judgmental. But extroverted judgers are judgmental, not in a sense of what they think the world should be, but you should be doing a specific thing, right? That's how effectiveness and harmony work. And the way for them to actually manage their environment as opposed to simply judge their environment is that co-pilot process. But they're gonna project. They're extroverts. They're gonna project. They're going to be more bombastic. I would say that actually effectiveness, interestingly enough, as a driver, can sometimes appear introverted because it doesn't necessarily require people to make it happen. Effectiveness requires a to-do list item to be crossed off. It requires doing things in the outside world that get goals accomplished. And sometimes you don't need anybody to make that happen. So sometimes effectiveness drivers can come across like an introvert because they're off doing busy things. I've had a lot of ENTJs test out as INTJs because they think they need alone time, when really it's not alone time they need. They need focused time to get things done, and other people mess that up. So this is one that's a little more complicated. And I would actually say that ENTJs will come across like introverts more than ESTJs. ESTJs will have more of a social component because they know that that's expected of them civilly. Like, to be a good civil, to be a good citizen, you got to engage with other people, right? So you got to be able to engage with them and talk with them on their level, and they're more okay with small talk. Whereas ENTJs enjoy the strategic conceptual piece more, and so they have more of a tendency to be in a perspective learning mode, which requires some sensory deprivation, right? Perspectives is the opposite of sensation, so it needs some sensory deprivation, so they'll pull away from people in order to get their most creative work done. So ENTJs will sometimes come across more like introverts. Interestingly enough, we're just about to go to the harmony drivers, and harmony, extroverted feeling, is the most social of all the extroverted processes. So when it comes to EJs, a couple of them might look more introverted and a couple of them will look the most social and extroverted. So keep that on your radar as we go through these 4 extroverted judging processes. ENTJs will be more interested in abstract conversation. They might not identify themselves that way because they're leading with effectiveness, which is about something working in the outside or concrete world. So they might have a turnoff to the word abstract. Think of it, again, like with the INTJs, less about abstractions and more about imagination, conceptualization, running simulations in their mind. That's something you want to, if you think you're on the path to an ENTJ and you think they might be intuitive sensory, you're not really sure because they're leading with thinking, so they're an ENTJ, but perspectives and sensation or memory exploration is their co-pilot 10-year-old, so that's more of the gray area, is what's in the conscious part of the car, the right hand part. And if you're trying to discern the difference or vet the difference between intuitive and sensing, sometimes a better question to ask is, are you always running simulations in your mind about what could be? Are you always thinking in terms of contingency plans? How far down the line are you planning? An ESTJ's timeline will probably be shorter into the future than an ENTJ's timeline. Okay, all right, so let's now go into the final 2. We're almost there. The final 2, we'll talk about the harmony drivers, or the EFJs, in the system next.